The building started shaking at exactly 2:47 p.m., but Mike Sullivan didn't run like everyone else. The 62-year-old janitor just stood there in the hallway of the 30-story office complex, calmly watching the ceiling tiles fall around him while hundreds of panicked office workers screamed and fled toward exits that were already blocked by twisted steel and concrete. What those terrified people didn't know was that the quiet old man they passed every day without a second glance, the one who mopped their floors and emptied their trash, had been waiting his entire retirement for this exact moment. Because Mike Sullivan wasn't really a janitor. He was the most decorated urban rescue specialist in American history, and he'd spent the last 3 years studying every inch of this building structure, memorizing every weakness, every exit route, every place where people might survive when impossible happened. And now, as 400 innocent people found themselves trapped in a collapsing death trap with no way out, they were about to learn that God had placed a guardian angel among them, one who'd been hiding in plain sight, wearing coveralls and pushing a mop bucket, just waiting for the day when his real job would begin. But before we reveal the shocking truth about this simple janitor and the incredible secret he's been carrying for decades, make sure you're subscribed to Those Who Left a Trace for more jaw-dropping stories of hidden heroes walking among us. Hit that notification bell, because what Mike does in the next few minutes will leave you speechless and prove that the most extraordinary people often look the most ordinary. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from today? Because what happens next will make you look at every janitor, every maintenance worker, every quiet person you pass on the street with completely different eyes. 3 years earlier, Mike Sullivan had walked into the employment office of Meridian Building Services carrying nothing but a worn leather wallet and a story about being a retired maintenance worker looking for part-time employment to supplement his Social Security. The hiring manager, a harried woman named Janet who was more concerned with filling positions than checking backgrounds, barely glanced at his application before offering him the night shift janitor position at the prestigious Meridian Office Complex downtown. What Janet didn't know, what nobody knew, was that the weatherman sitting across from her desk had spent 38 years as Captain Miracle Mike Sullivan, the legendary commander of FEMA's most elite urban search and rescue task force. His personnel file, sealed in classified government archives, contained commendations from 3 presidents, documentation of 847 successful rescues from disasters that had made international headlines, and a service record that read like a catalog of every major catastrophe that had struck American soil in the past 4 decades. Mike had pulled survivors from the smoking ruins of the World Trade Center, where he'd spent 17 straight days digging through twisted steel and pulverized concrete, refusing to leave until every possible survivor had been found. He'd commanded rescue operations at the Oklahoma City bombing, where his innovative techniques for stabilizing damaged structures had become standard protocol for urban rescue teams worldwide. He'd led teams into the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the 1994 Northridge earthquake, the collapse of the I-35W bridge in Minneapolis, and dozens of smaller disasters where his expertise had meant the difference between life and death for hundreds of trapped victims. His nickname, Miracle Mike, hadn't come from luck. It had been earned through an almost supernatural ability to find life in places where death should have been certain. Mike could read the language of twisted steel and broken concrete, like other people read newspapers. He knew exactly how much weight a damaged beam could support, precisely where air pockets would form in collapsed structures, and exactly how long human beings could survive in conditions that would kill most people within hours. Mike's understanding of structural engineering was largely self-taught, developed through decades of crawling through the wreckage of buildings that had failed in every conceivable way. He'd seen how concrete cracked under different types of stress, how steel beams twisted when subjected to loads they weren't designed to carry, and how modern building techniques could create both incredible strength and devastating weaknesses, depending on how they were implemented. This knowledge had made him invaluable to rescue operations, but it had also given him a unique and often disturbing perspective on the buildings where ordinary people lived and worked every day. When Mike looked at a skyscraper, he didn't see architectural beauty or corporate success. He saw potential failure points, escape routes, and the places where people would be trapped if the worst happened. It was a perspective that served him well in his rescue career, but it had also made retirement incredibly difficult, as he found himself constantly analyzing the structural integrity of every building he entered and worrying about the people who trusted their lives to engineering decisions they didn't understand. Mike's decision to retire hadn't been voluntary in the traditional sense. After 38 years of pulling bodies from rubble, some alive, many not, he'd finally reached a point where the accumulated trauma of seeing so much death and destruction had begun to affect his judgment and his health. The breaking point had come during a school collapse in Missouri, where he'd spent 4 days searching for survivors in a building that had been brought down by a tornado. He'd saved 11 children and 3 teachers, but the 12 children he hadn't been able to reach in time had haunted him in ways that previous losses hadn't. The nightmares had started then, vivid dreams where he was perpetually searching through rubble for voices that called out for help but could never be reached. He'd wake up covered in sweat, his hands cramped as if he'd been digging through concrete all night. His doctor had recommended counseling, medication, and immediate retirement before the stress of his career caused a complete psychological breakdown. But even in retirement, Mike couldn't turn off 38 years of training and instinct. Every building he entered was automatically cataloged for structural weaknesses and escape routes. Every crowd he was part of was mentally organized for evacuation procedures. Every routine trip to the grocery store or doctor's office became an unconscious exercise in threat assessment and emergency planning. He was a man whose entire identity had been built around saving people in crisis situations, and civilian life felt like being perpetually on standby for a mission that never came. The janitor job at Meridian had seemed like the perfect solution to his restlessness. It would give him something to do with his days, provide a small income to supplement his pension, and put him in an environment where his hypervigilance and attention to detail would be useful rather than disruptive. He'd told himself that pushing a mop and emptying trash cans would be therapeutic. Simple, straightforward work that didn't require life or death decisions or the weight of other people's survival resting on his shoulders. What Mike hadn't anticipated was how working in the Meridian Office Complex would reactivate every instinct he developed over his rescue career. The building was 30 stories of glass and steel that housed nearly 800 employees across dozens of companies. And from his first day on the job, Mike had found himself unconsciously cataloging every aspect of its construction and maintenance. The Meridian had been built 15 years earlier during a construction boom that had prioritized speed and cost savings over long-term structural integrity. Mike's trained eye could see the corners that had been cut, the maintenance that had been deferred, and the warning signs that building management either ignored or covered up rather than addressed. He'd noticed stress cracks in the parking garage that had been painted over rather than repaired. He'd seen water damage in the basement that suggested foundation problems. He'd observed that several of the building's emergency exits had been blocked by storage or renovation work, and that the fire suppression system hadn't been properly maintained. Most concerning of all, Mike had realized that the Meridian was built on soil that had been improperly compacted during the original construction, creating a foundation that was slowly settling in ways that put increasing stress on the building's support structure. It was the kind of problem that could remain stable for years or decades, but that could also result in catastrophic failure if the right combination of factors ever came together. Mike had tried to report his concerns through official channels, but his warnings had been dismissed by building management as the paranoid observations of an overcautious janitor who didn't understand modern construction techniques. When he persisted in raising safety issues, he'd been warned that continued inappropriate comments about building safety could result in the termination of his employment. The clear message was that his job was to clean floors and empty trash cans, not provide engineering assessments that nobody wanted to hear. So Mike had stopped making official reports, but he hadn't stopped preparing for what his experience told him was an inevitable disaster. Over 3 years, he gradually accumulated emergency equipment that he kept hidden in various locations throughout the building. He'd memorized the location of every utility shutoff, every structural support, and every potential escape route in the complex. He'd identified the strongest and weakest points in the building's architecture, and he developed contingency plans for dozens of different emergency scenarios. Mike's co-workers and the office employees he encountered every day had no idea that the quiet man who mopped their floors was conducting the most comprehensive safety assessment in the building's history. They saw him as part of the invisible infrastructure, no more noteworthy than the elevators or the air conditioning system, and Mike had deliberately cultivated that perception. He arrived early, worked efficiently, and avoided interactions that might draw attention to his background or his concerns about the building's safety. To the hundreds of office workers who passed him every day, Mike was just another older worker who'd been forced into service jobs by economic necessity. They saw the faded blue coveralls, the worn work boots, and the quiet demeanor of someone who'd learned to keep his head down and do his job without causing trouble. They had no reason to suspect that the man emptying their trash cans had once been featured on the cover of Time magazine as America's guardian angel, or that he'd received personal commendations from 3 presidents for his heroism during national disasters. Mike's physical appearance reinforced their assumptions about his background and capabilities. At 62, he had the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in harsh conditions, with deep lines around gray eyes that had seen too much in hands that were scarred from years of dangerous work. He stood 5 feet 10 inches with a wiry, compact build that came from a lifetime of physical labor rather than gym workouts. His silver hair was always neatly trimmed, but he moved with the careful precision of someone whose knees and back carried the accumulated damage of a demanding career. What people didn't notice was the way Mike's eyes constantly scanned his environment, automatically cataloging potential hazards and escape routes. They didn't see how he positioned himself near exits during conversations, or how he tested the stability of handrails and support structures as he worked. They missed the subtle signs that this was a man whose survival instincts had been honed through decades of life-threatening situations, and who couldn't turn off that awareness even in the apparently safe environment of a modern office building. Mike's daily routine had become a careful balance between performing his janitorial duties and conducting his own private safety inspections. He'd arrive at 6 a.m., 2 hours before the earliest office workers, and spend the first part of his shift checking areas of the building that he couldn't access during normal business hours. He'd test the structural integrity of stairwells, examine the condition of emergency equipment, and monitor the building's response to normal settling and thermal expansion. During business hours, Mike moved through the building like a ghost, cleaning and maintaining while simultaneously observing and analyzing. He'd learned to read the building's moods, the subtle sounds that indicated normal settling versus concerning structural stress, the patterns of vibration that suggested equipment problems versus structural issues, and environmental changes that might indicate developing problems with the building's foundation or support systems. Mike's most serious concern centered around what he'd identified as a critical weakness in the building's eastern support column system. The Meridian had been designed with an innovative structural system that distributed weight through a network of interconnected supports, but Mike's analysis suggested that the system had a catastrophic failure point that could result in progressive collapse if the right combination of stresses ever occurred. It was the kind of engineering flaw that might never be discovered through normal inspections, but that could turn a minor structural event into a major disaster. The eastern columns showed signs of stress that had been developing slowly over the building's 15-year lifespan. Mike had documented hairline cracks that were growing imperceptibly, settling patterns that suggested uneven foundation support, and vibration characteristics that indicated the columns were carrying more load than they'd been designed to handle. His analysis suggested that a relatively minor seismic event, not even a major earthquake, just a small tremor, could trigger a cascade failure that would bring down the entire eastern section of the building. Mike had tried repeatedly to communicate these concerns to building management, but his warnings had been dismissed as the overreactions of a janitor who didn't understand modern engineering. The building's official safety inspections, conducted by contractors hired by the building's ownership company, had consistently found no significant problems. These inspections, however, were focused on obvious safety violations rather than the subtle structural issues that Mike's experience had taught him to recognize. The frustration of knowing that hundreds of people were working every day in a building that he believed was unsafe had been eating at Mike for months. He considered quitting his job and reported his concerns to city building inspectors, but he knew that his warnings would carry little weight coming from a janitor with no official engineering credentials. He'd also realized that if his fears were justified, leaving the building would mean abandoning the people who worked there to face a disaster without anyone present who had the skills and experience to help them survive. So Mike had stayed, continuing his janitorial duties while secretly preparing for the disaster he believed was inevitable. He'd gradually smuggled emergency equipment into the building, hiding rescue tools and communication gear in locations throughout the complex. He developed detailed evacuation plans for different areas of the building, identified safe zones where people could shelter during collapse, and prepared contingency protocols for dozens of different emergency scenarios. Mike's emergency preparations have been motivated by more than just professional instinct. They've been driven by a profound sense of responsibility for the innocent people who trusted their safety to building systems they didn't understand. Every day as he mopped floors and emptied trash cans, he was surrounded by hundreds of workers who had no idea they were potentially in danger and no preparation for how to respond if that danger became reality. They were teachers and accountants, lawyers and graphic designers, administrative assistants and executives. People whose biggest daily worry was meeting deadlines or managing office politics, not surviving structural collapse or navigating through rubble-filled stairwells. The weight of that responsibility had been almost unbearable for Mike, especially given his inability to convince anyone in authority that his concerns were valid. He'd found himself making mental notes about which employees had mobility issues that would make evacuation difficult, which floors had the highest concentration people, and which areas of the building would be most likely to trap survivors if a collapse occurred. It was an exhausting way to live, but Mike's 38 years of rescue experience had taught him that preparation and vigilance were the only defenses against the unexpected disasters that could turn ordinary days into life-or-death struggles. Mike's extensive preparations included not just equipment and planning, but also physical and mental conditioning to ensure that he'd be capable of performing rescue operations despite his age and retirement status. Every morning before work, he'd run 5 miles through his neighborhood, maintaining the cardiovascular fitness that would be essential for prolonged rescue operations in challenging conditions. He kept up his strength training, focusing on the functional fitness needed to move through unstable structures while carrying injured people or heavy equipment. More importantly, Mike had maintained his mental readiness for the kind of high-stress decision-making that rescue operations required. He'd studied updates to rescue techniques and equipment, stayed current with building codes and structural engineering developments, and regularly reviewed case studies of recent disasters to learn from the experiences of other rescue teams. He'd also worked to address the psychological trauma that had driven him into retirement, developing coping mechanisms that would allow him to function effectively in crisis situations without being overwhelmed by the emotional weight of life-or-death decisions. The irony of Mike's situation wasn't lost on him. He was a man who'd spent his entire career saving people from disasters, who'd been forced into retirement by the psychological toll of that work, and who then found himself in a position where he was the only person capable of saving hundreds of people from a disaster that nobody else wanted to acknowledge was possible. It was as if fate had conspired to put him exactly where he needed to be, at exactly the right time, with exactly the right combination of skills and preparation to make the difference between tragedy and survival. Mike's daily routine had become a strange combination of mundane janitorial tasks and intensive disaster preparation. He'd spend his mornings emptying trash cans and mopping floors while mentally rehearsing evacuation routes and rescue procedures. He'd clean windows while checking the structural integrity of window frames and emergency exit mechanisms. He'd restock bathroom supplies while testing the building's emergency lighting and communication systems. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a dedicated janitor who took unusual pride in his work. They had no idea he was conducting the most comprehensive emergency preparedness assessment in the building's history. The routine had continued for 3 years, with Mike growing increasingly concerned about the building's condition while feeling increasingly isolated by his inability to convince anyone else that his fears were justified. He'd begun to wonder if retirement had affected his judgment, if his decades of seeing the worst-case scenarios had made him paranoid about dangers that existed only in his imagination. The building had survived 15 years without any major incidents. Maybe his concerns were just the overreactions of an old rescue worker who couldn't accept that some buildings were actually as safe as they appeared to be. Those doubts had persisted until 2:47 p.m. on what had started as a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, when a minor seismic event, barely strong enough to register on geological monitoring equipment, had struck the city with exactly the frequency and intensity that Mike's analysis had identified as the building's critical vulnerability point. In that moment, 3 years of preparation and 38 years of experience had suddenly become the only thing standing between 400 innocent people and certain death. The first sign that Mike's worst fears were coming true had been a subtle vibration in the building's floor that felt different from the normal settling and thermal expansion he'd become accustomed to monitoring. It was a resonant frequency that seemed to build rather than dissipate, creating a harmonic effect that he recognized from his experience with earthquake damage to buildings with similar structural vulnerabilities. Mike had been mopping the 23rd floor hallway when he felt that first ominous vibration, and his immediate reaction had been to stop what he was doing and listen carefully to the building's response. What he heard confirmed his worst fears. The building was beginning to resonate in a way that suggested the eastern support columns were being stressed beyond their design limits. The sound was almost inaudible, a low-frequency humming that most people would dismiss as normal building noise. But to Mike's trained ear, it was the sound of a structure beginning to fail in exactly the way his analysis had predicted. Mike's response to that first warning sign had been immediate and decisive. Rather than joining the general evacuation that was beginning as people noticed the building's unusual movement, he'd headed straight for his emergency equipment cache and begun the transformation from janitor to rescue specialist that he'd been mentally rehearsing for 3 years. Every piece of equipment was exactly where he'd placed it. Every tool was in perfect working condition, and every contingency plan was ready for immediate implementation. The building's collapse had begun exactly as Mike's analysis had predicted it would, with a failure of a critical support column in the eastern section, which had then created a progressive cascade of structural failures that spread throughout the building's interconnected support system. The process had been terrifyingly fast once it started, with each failing component creating additional stress on the remaining supports until the entire structure was in free fall. But Mike's 3 years of preparation had given him advantages that no external rescue team could match. He knew exactly which areas of the building were most likely to survive partial collapse, precisely where survivors would be trapped, and exactly how to navigate through the unstable wreckage to reach them. His equipment was already positioned throughout the building. His communication systems were independent of the building's failing infrastructure, and his knowledge of the structure was more comprehensive than any blueprint or engineering report. Most importantly, Mike was already inside the building when the collapse began, which meant he could begin rescue operations immediately rather than waiting for external teams to arrive, assess the situation, and develop action plans. In disasters like this, the first hour was critical. Most survivors of building collapses who were going to be saved alive were found within 60 minutes of the incident. After that, crush injuries, dehydration, and suffocation began to claim lives that might otherwise have been saved. Mike's first priority had been establishing communication with the outside world and providing emergency responders with intelligence about the building's condition and the location of survivors. Using his hidden communication equipment, he'd patched into emergency frequencies and begun transmitting detailed information about structural stability, survivor locations, and optimal approach routes for incoming rescue teams. This coordination was crucial because external rescue teams would need his guidance to avoid areas where additional collapse was likely and focus their efforts on locations where rescues were actually possible. But even as he coordinated with external responders, Mike knew that the majority of the rescue work would have to be done by him, working alone inside the unstable structure. The building's collapse had created conditions that were too dangerous for conventional rescue operations. The structure was still actively failing. Debris was continuing to fall, and most of the traditional access routes had been blocked or destroyed. Only someone with Mike's experience and knowledge of the building's layout could navigate through the wreckage safely, while carrying the equipment necessary to save lives. Mike's rescue operations had begun on the upper floors, where his analysis suggested the greatest number of survivors would be trapped, but where the structural damage would be most severe. This was counterintuitive to normal rescue protocols, which typically focus on easily accessible areas first. But Mike's experience had taught him that in progressive collapse situations, people trapped in high locations often had less time before their refuge areas became completely inaccessible. The first rescue had taken Mike to the 28th floor, where thermal imaging indicated a cluster of heat signatures in what appeared to be a conference room. Reaching that location had required climbing through stairwells filled with debris, crossing floors where the concrete was cracking in real time, and navigating around sections where the building's steel framework was twisting under stresses it was never designed to handle. The route had been dangerous enough that even Mike, with all his experience, had questioned whether the risk was justified. But the alternative was to leave 8 people die in a location where no other rescuer could reach them. The conference room rescue had been a masterpiece of improvised engineering and tactical planning. The room itself was intact, but the hallway leading to it had been partially collapsed, and the floor beneath it was no longer structurally sound. Mike had been forced to create an alternate escape route by cutting through a wall into an adjacent office, then rappelling down the building's exterior to reach a lower floor where the structure was more stable. The entire operation had taken 45 minutes and had required every piece of specialized equipment he'd accumulated over 3 years of preparation. But the success of that first rescue had proven that Mike's assessment of the building's condition was accurate and that his rescue techniques were effective under these conditions. More importantly, it had demonstrated to the trapped survivors throughout the building that rescue was possible, and that someone with the skills to save them was already working inside the wreckage. The psychological impact of that hope couldn't be quantified, but Mike knew from experience that people who believed rescue was coming were far more likely to survive long enough to be found than those who gave up hope. Mike's second major rescue had been even more challenging, involving a group of 12 office workers who'd been trapped in an elevator shaft when the building's power systems had failed during the initial collapse. The elevator car had been stopped between the 15th and 16th floors, suspended by cables that were still intact, but that could fail at any moment as the building continued to settle. The shaft itself had been partially filled with debris from the floors above, creating a rescue scenario that combined the dangers of confined space operations, unstable structures, and potential equipment failures. The elevator rescue had required Mike to establish a complex rigging system that could support the weight of multiple people while providing a safe descent route through the partially blocked shaft. He'd been forced to cut to the elevator car's roof, then lower each survivor individually through a debris field that shifted constantly as the building continued to settle around them. The operation had taken over an hour and had pushed Mike's physical capabilities to their limits, but all 12 people had been successfully evacuated to a safe area where they could be reached by conventional rescue teams. Each rescue operation had presented unique challenges that required Mike to adapt his techniques and improvise solutions with whatever equipment was available. Some survivors have been trapped in areas where the doors have been jammed shut by the shifting structure, requiring Mike to cut new openings or find alternate routes through walls and ceilings. Others have been injured by falling debris and needed medical treatment before they could be moved safely. Still others were in areas where structural damage was so severe that traditional rescue techniques wouldn't work, forcing Mike to develop entirely new approaches based on his understanding of the building's construction and the physics of structural collapse. The most emotionally challenging rescue had involved a group of children who'd been visiting the building on a school field trip when the collapse occurred. They'd been trapped in a 22nd floor office suite with 2 adult chaperones, in an area where the floor had partially separated from the building's main structure and was held in place only by a few remaining support beams. The rescue had required extreme delicacy to avoid disturbing precarious balance that was keeping their refuge area from falling 22 stories to the ground. Mike's approach to the children's rescue had been to use the building's ventilation system to reach their location without putting additional stress on the failing floor supports. He crawled through ductwork for over 200 feet, carrying specialized equipment in a space barely large enough for his body, to reach an air vent that opened into the office where the children were trapped. The extraction had then required lowering each child individually through the ventilation system to a more stable part of the building, a process that had taken 3 hours and had tested Mike's patience and endurance as much as his technical skills. But perhaps the most technically demanding rescue had been saving a pregnant woman who'd been trapped in a bathroom on the 19th floor when debris had blocked the only exit. The woman was in labor, experiencing complications that required immediate medical attention, and was located in an area where the building structure was so unstable that even Mike's movements could trigger additional collapse. The rescue had required him to perform emergency medical procedures while simultaneously creating an escape route through a load-bearing wall, all while working in a space that was actively shifting and settling around them. The medical aspects of many rescues had required Mike to draw on training that went far beyond his structural expertise. During his career with FEMA, he'd become qualified as an emergency medical technician specifically to handle the medical emergencies that were common in disaster situations. He'd treated everything from crush injuries and dehydration to heart attacks and psychological trauma, often working in conditions where conventional medical equipment wasn't available and where his decisions meant the difference between life and death for injured survivors. Mike's rescue operations had continued for nearly 6 hours, as he worked systematically through the building to reach every survivor location that his thermal imaging equipment could identify. Each rescue had been more challenging than the last, as the building's structural condition continued to deteriorate and the remaining stable areas became fewer and more difficult to reach. The physical demands of the work had been enormous. Mike had climbed the equivalent of dozens of flights of stairs while carrying heavy equipment, crawled through hundreds of feet of confined spaces, and performed manual labor that would have exhausted men half his age. But the psychological demands have been even greater, as Mike had been forced to make life-or-death decisions about which rescues were possible and which would be too dangerous to attempt. There had been several situations where his thermal imaging had detected survivors in locations that were simply too unstable to reach safely, forcing him to make the agonizing choice between risking his own life and the lives of people he'd already rescued, or leaving others to die when he might have been able to save them. The most heartbreaking of these decisions had involved an elderly security guard who'd been trapped in the building's lobby when the main entrance had been blocked by debris. The man was alive and conscious, but he was located directly beneath a section of the building that was held up only by a single damaged support beam. Mike's structural analysis told him that any attempt to reach the guard would likely trigger the final collapse of that section, killing both of them and potentially causing additional failures that could trap other survivors he'd already located. Mike had been forced to maintain radio contact with the guard while working on other rescues, providing encouragement and medical guidance while knowing that external rescue teams would never be able to reach him in time. The man had died alone, still talking to Mike over the radio, about 20 minutes before the section he was trapped in finally collapsed completely. It was the kind of loss that Mike's retirement had been intended to help him avoid, but that had become inevitable once he'd taken on the responsibility of coordinating rescue operations in a disaster of this magnitude. The emotional weight of these decisions had been balanced by the incredible satisfaction of successful rescues and the knowledge that his presence in the building had made the difference between life and death for dozens of people. Every person he'd saved was someone who would go home to their family, someone whose children wouldn't lose a parent, someone whose spouse wouldn't become a widow or widower. The mathematical reality was stark. Without Mike's intervention, the survival rate from the Meridian collapse would have been less than 20%. With his rescue operations, over 85% of the people in the building had survived. The final phase of Mike's rescue operations had focused on coordinating with external rescue teams to ensure that all the survivors he'd moved to safe areas could be evacuated from the building before it suffered complete structural failure. This had required establishing secure communication links with incident commanders outside the building, providing detailed intelligence about structural conditions and survivor locations, and guiding external teams through safe routes to reach the people he'd already rescued. Mike's knowledge of the building's condition had been crucial for external rescue operations because the structural damage was so extensive that conventional assessment techniques couldn't provide accurate information about which areas were safe for rescue teams to enter. His 3 years of daily observation, combined with his real-time analysis of how the building was failing, had given him insights that no external engineer could match. He'd been able to predict which sections were likely to collapse next, identify safe routes through the wreckage, and warn rescue teams away from areas where their presence could trigger additional failures. The coordination with external teams had also allowed Mike to focus on the most challenging rescues, while leaving more straightforward operations to conventional rescue personnel. This division of labor had been essential because Mike's specialized skills were most valuable in situations that other rescuers couldn't handle, while standard rescue techniques could be used effectively for survivors who were trapped in more accessible locations. By the time the last survivor had been evacuated from the Meridian Office Complex, Mike had personally rescued 47 people from situations where survival should have been impossible, coordinated the rescue of dozens more, and provided the intelligence and guidance that had made the entire operation possible. The total rescue count had been 381 people saved out of 400 who'd been trapped when the building collapsed, a survival rate that defied every statistical model and exceeded what anyone had thought possible in a catastrophic structural failure of that magnitude. By the time the last survivor had been evacuated from the Meridian Office Complex, Mike had personally rescued 47 people from situations where survival should have been impossible, coordinated the rescue of dozens more, and provided intelligence and guidance that had made the entire operation possible. The total rescue count had been 381 people saved out of 400 who'd been trapped when the building collapsed. A survival rate that defied every statistical model and exceeded what anyone had thought possible in a catastrophic structural failure of that magnitude. The physical and emotional toll of the rescue operations had been enormous, but Mike had found that return to active rescue work had been unexpectedly therapeutic. For the first time since his retirement, he'd been doing the work he was truly meant to do, using every skill he developed over 38 years to save lives in the most challenging conditions imaginable. The psychological trauma that had driven him into retirement hadn't disappeared, but had been overshadowed by the profound satisfaction of knowing that his experience and expertise had prevented an unthinkable tragedy. As Mike emerged from the Meridian Office Complex for the final time, carrying the last survivor on his back through a route that collapsed completely just minutes after they'd passed through it, he was exhausted, injured, and covered in concrete dust, but he was also more at peace with himself than he'd been in years. He'd proven that his concerns about the building had been justified, that his preparations had been worthwhile, and that his decision to stay in the building despite the risks had saved hundreds of lives. The media coverage of the Meridian rescue had been extensive, but Mike had declined all interview requests and had disappeared from public view as quickly as he'd emerged from retirement. The official reports had focused on the technical aspects of the rescue operations and the coordination between different emergency response agencies, while carefully avoiding details that might compromise Mike's privacy or reveal the extent of his unofficial preparation for the disaster. But among the rescue community, Mike's performance at Meridian had become legendary. The techniques he developed for navigating unstable structures had been incorporated into training programs for urban rescue teams. His improvised medical procedures had been documented and shared with emergency medical services. His approach to survivor psychology and communication had been studied by disaster response specialists. Most importantly, his demonstration that a single experienced rescuer could make an enormous difference in a major disaster had changed how emergency planners thought about resource allocation and response strategies. The people Mike had saved had never forgotten the quiet man who'd worked alongside them for years, carrying secrets that could save lives and skills that could cheat death. Many of them had tried to contact him after the rescue to express their gratitude, but Mike had made it clear that their survival was all the thanks he needed. He'd done what needed to be done, and that was reward enough. But the impact of Mike's heroism had extended far beyond the immediate survivors of the Meridian collapse. His story had become a symbol of the hidden heroes who worked among ordinary people, carrying extraordinary capabilities and waiting for the moments when their skills would be needed most. It had changed how people looked at janitors, maintenance workers, and other service employees, reminding them that appearance and job title often had little connection to someone's true capabilities or worth. Most importantly, Mike's story had proven that age and retirement didn't necessarily mean the end of someone's ability to serve others in crisis situations. His performance at Meridian had been possible only because of the experience and knowledge he'd accumulated over decades of rescue work, and because of the physical and mental preparation he'd maintained even after leaving active service. It was a reminder that society's most valuable resources were often experienced professionals who dedicated their lives to specialized skills that became crucial during emergencies. Years later, when engineering studies of the Meridian collapse confirmed that Mike's structural analysis had been completely accurate, his warnings about the building's vulnerabilities were vindicated in the most tragic way possible. The failure had occurred exactly as he predicted, through exactly the mechanism he'd identified, and with exactly the catastrophic consequences he'd tried to prevent. But while the building's owners and management company faced lawsuits and criminal charges for ignoring safety concerns, Mike felt no satisfaction in being proven right about something he desperately hoped would never happen. The survivors of the Meridian collapse had gone on to live full lives, but they carried with them the knowledge that their survival had depended on the presence of someone whose true capabilities had been completely hidden from them until a moment when those capabilities had become the difference between life and death. They'd learned that heroes don't always announce themselves, that expertise can be found in the most unexpected places, and that the most important qualifications for saving lives are often invisible to casual observation. Some of the survivors have been inspired by Mike's example to pursue careers in emergency services or disaster response. Others have become advocates for building safety and structural integrity. Still others had simply tried to live their lives in ways that honored the sacrifice and dedication of someone who'd risked everything to save them without expecting recognition or reward. But all of them had been changed by the experience of being saved by someone they'd never really seen, and of learning that heroes often work among us in disguise, waiting patiently for the moments when their true calling becomes clear. Mike himself had eventually found a different kind of peace, working as a consultant for building safety assessments and emergency preparedness planning. He'd never again taken a job that required him to hide his capabilities or ignore potential dangers, but he'd also never sought publicity or recognition for what had become the most famous rescue operation in American history. He'd simply continued doing what he'd always done, using his skills and experience to protect people from dangers they couldn't see coming, and ensuring that when disasters did occur, someone would be prepared to help survivors through the worst moments of their lives. And somewhere in another city, in another building, another Mike Sullivan might be pushing a mop cart and keeping his head down, carrying experience and expertise that could save hundreds of lives when impossible happened and ordinary people needed extraordinary help from someone they'd never noticed was there, looking after them. The quiet heroes who moved through the world without fanfare, whose greatest victories were the disasters that never made headlines because they'd been prevented, and whose deepest satisfaction came from knowing that their vigilance meant others could sleep safely in buildings they trusted protect them. In the months following the Meridian collapse, investigations into disaster revealed a systematic pattern of negligence and cover-ups that vindicated every concern Mike had raised during his 3 years as a janitor. The building's foundation had indeed been improperly constructed, using substandard materials and techniques that had created exactly the vulnerabilities Mike had identified. The stress cracks he documented had been evidence of progressive structural failure that building management had deliberately concealed from safety inspectors and tenants. Most damning of all, the investigation revealed that Mike had submitted 14 separate written reports about safety concerns to building management over his 3 years of employment, and that every one of these reports had been filed away without action and deliberately excluded from the building's official safety records. The building's owners had made a calculated decision that addressing Mike's concerns would be more expensive than dealing with potential lawsuits if his warnings proved accurate. The criminal trials that followed the investigation resulted in multiple convictions for negligent homicide, conspiracy to defraud safety inspectors, and criminal endangerment. The 19 people who had died in the collapse could have been saved if Mike's warnings had been heeded and proper repairs had been made to the building's structural deficiencies. The financial settlements for survivors and victims' families totaled over $2 billion, bankrupting the building's ownership company and creating new legal precedents for corporate responsibility in building safety. But for Mike, the vindication of his concerns brought no satisfaction. Only the knowledge that 19 innocent people had died because their safety had been less important to building management than the cost of structural repairs. The guilt of not having done more to force action on his warnings added another layer to the psychological burden he carried, even though any objective analysis would conclude that he'd done everything possible to prevent the disaster within the constraints of his position and authority. The psychological aftermath of Meridian rescue had been complex for Mike, combining the satisfaction of successful rescue operations with the trauma of the lives he hadn't been able to save and the guilt of having possessed knowledge that could have prevented the disaster entirely. His experience had proven that his decision to remain in the building had been correct, but it had also highlighted the terrible isolation of being the only person who understood the magnitude of the danger facing hundreds of innocent people. Mike's therapy sessions in the months following the rescue had focused on helping him process these conflicting emotions while developing a framework for using his experience constructively rather than allowing it to become another source of psychological trauma. His therapist had helped him understand that his heroism during the collapse had redeemed rather than negated his earlier inability to prevent the disaster, and that his future work in building safety could honor the memory of those who had died while protecting others from similar tragedies. The transformation in Mike's public profile had been dramatic but unwelcome. Where he had once been invisible to the people around him, he was now recognized wherever he went as the Meridian Hero, a label that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Mike had never sought recognition for his rescue work, and the attention that followed the collapse made it impossible for him to maintain the anonymity that had allowed him to observe and analyze potential dangers without drawing attention to himself. Media requests for interviews had been constant for months after the rescue, with reporters documentary filmmakers, and book publishers offering enormous sums for exclusive access to Mike's story. He had declined every request, maintaining that his actions during the collapse were simply what any trained rescue professional would have done under the circumstances, and that the real story was a negligence that had made the disaster possible rather than the heroism that had followed it. Mike's reluctance to capitalize on his heroism had only increased public fascination with his story, creating a mythology around him that bore little resemblance to the reality of his experience. News reports had described him as a guardian angel and a miracle worker, while conspiracy theorists had suggested that his presence in the building couldn't have been coincidental and that he must have had advance warning of the collapse. The truth, that Mike had been a highly trained professional who had recognized obvious danger signs that building management had chosen to ignore, was less dramatic than the mythologized version, but far more important for understanding how similar disasters could be prevented in the future. Mike's real contribution hadn't been supernatural prescience or miraculous heroism, but the application of professional expertise and ethical responsibility in a situation where those qualities had been desperately needed. The offers of employment that had followed Mike's emergence as a public figure had been numerous and lucrative, but he had been selective about which opportunities aligned with his values and his desire to use his experience constructively. Several private security companies had offered him consulting contracts that would have made him wealthy, but Mike had been uncomfortable with work that focused on protecting corporate interests rather than public safety. Instead, Mike had chosen to work with government agencies and nonprofit organizations that were focused on improving building safety standards and emergency preparedness. His consulting work had taken him to buildings across the country where he provided structural assessments, developed emergency response plans, and trained local rescue personnel in advanced techniques for dealing with building collapses and other structural disasters. This work had been deeply satisfying for Mike because it allowed him to use his experience proactively rather than reactively, identifying and addressing potential dangers before they could result in casualties. Every building he inspected, every safety protocol he developed, and every rescue team he trained represented an opportunity to prevent future Meridians and protect innocent people from dangers they couldn't see or understand. Mike's consulting work had also revealed that the structural problems he'd identified at Meridian were far from unique. Across the country, aging buildings were developing similar vulnerabilities as a result of deferred maintenance, substandard original construction, and the natural deterioration that occurred when structures were used beyond their intended lifespan. Many of these problems were being ignored or concealed by building owners who viewed safety improvements as unnecessary expenses rather than moral obligations. The pattern was disturbingly familiar to Mike. Building management companies that prioritized short-term profits over long-term safety, safety inspectors who were either incompetent or corrupted, and regulatory systems that were more focused on bureaucratic compliance than actual protection of public safety. The Meridian disaster had been a symptom of a much larger problem in how society balanced economic interests against human life and safety. Mike's advocacy for stronger building safety regulations had made him a controversial figure within construction and real estate industries, where his recommendations for mandatory safety improvements were seen as threats to profitability. Industry representatives had criticized his assessments as overly cautious and had suggested that his experience at Meridian had made him paranoid about dangers that existed only in his imagination. But Mike's credibility had been unassailable because his warnings about Meridian had been documented years before the collapse occurred, and because every aspect of his structural analysis had been confirmed by post-disaster investigations. When Mike identified potential problems in other buildings, owners and regulatory agencies took his concerns seriously rather than dismissing them as the overreactions of a paranoid janitor. The broader impact of Mike's advocacy had been the development of new building safety standards that required more comprehensive structural assessments, more frequent safety inspections, and more transparency in reporting potential hazards to tenants and workers. These changes have been expensive for building owners to implement, but they had also prevented numerous potential disasters and saved countless lives that would have been lost if existing safety standards had remained unchanged. Mike's work had also influenced the training and deployment of urban rescue teams, with many of his improvised techniques from the Meridian Rescue being incorporated into standard operating procedures for dealing with building collapses. His emphasis on advanced preparation, detailed structural knowledge, and immediate response had become central elements of modern rescue doctrine, potentially improving survival rates for future disasters. Perhaps most importantly, Mike's story had changed how emergency planners thought about resource allocation and expertise deployment during disasters. His demonstration that a single experienced professional could make an enormous difference in casualty rates had led to programs that identified and prepositioned specialized personnel in high-risk areas, ensuring that expertise would be immediately available when disasters occurred rather than having to be brought in from distant locations. The personal relationships Mike had developed with the people he'd saved had been one of the most meaningful aspects of his post-Meridian life. While he had declined to participate in formal reunions or commemoration events, he had maintained quiet contact with many of the survivors, following their recovery and celebrating their achievements as they rebuilt their lives after the trauma of the collapse. These relationships had provided Mike with ongoing evidence of the value of his actions during the disaster, as he watched people who had died without his intervention go on to graduate from college, get married, have children, and contribute to their communities in ways that created ripple effects of positive impact, extending far beyond the immediate rescue. Every milestone in their lives was a reminder that his heroism had consequences that would continue for generations. Some of the survivors had dedicated their lives to honoring Mike's example, pursuing careers in emergency services, structural engineering, or building safety advocacy. Others had simply tried to live their lives in ways that justified the sacrifice he had made to save them, becoming better parents, more devoted spouses, or more engaged community members, because they understood how precious and fragile life could be. The children who had been saved during the school field trip had been particularly meaningful to Mike, as he watched them grow up with a deep appreciation for the fragility of safety and the importance of the people who work to protect others. Several of them had written to him over the years, describing how their experience during the collapse had influenced their career choices and their understanding of heroism and service. One of those children, a girl named Sarah who had been 8 years old during collapse, had become a structural engineer specifically because of her experience with Mike during the rescue. In her letter to him on her graduation from engineering school, she had written, "You taught me that the most important job anyone can have is protecting people from dangers they can't see coming. I want to spend my career making sure that no other children have to go through what we went through, and that no other heroes have to risk their lives because someone else didn't do their job properly." Mike's influence on the rescue community had extended beyond technical innovations to include changes in how rescue professionals thought about their careers and their responsibilities to the communities they served. His example of maintaining readiness and vigilance, even during retirement, had inspired other former rescue workers to stay engaged with emergency preparedness and disaster response, creating a network of experienced professionals who could be called upon during major incidents. The concept of civilian embedded specialists, highly trained professionals who worked in ordinary jobs while maintaining emergency response capabilities, had emerged from analysis of Mike's effectiveness during the Meridian collapse. Emergency planners had realized that having expertise already positioned in high-risk locations could dramatically improve response times and casualty rates during disasters, leading to programs that encourage retired rescue workers, military personnel, and medical professionals to take jobs in critical facilities while maintaining their emergency response qualifications. Mike's story had also influenced policy discussions about the social value of experience and expertise, particularly in relation to age discrimination and retirement practices. His demonstration that a 62-year-old could outperform younger rescue workers in the most demanding conditions had challenged assumptions about the relationship between age and capability, leading to changes in mandatory retirement policies for emergency services and other safety-critical professions. The economic analysis of Mike's impact during the Meridian collapse had been staggering in its implications for how society valued expertise and experience. Economists had calculated that his presence in the building had prevented approximately $50 billion in economic losses that would have resulted from the additional casualties that would have occurred without his intervention. This analysis had included not just the immediate costs of medical care and compensation for victims, but the lifetime economic productivity of the people he had saved and the broader economic impacts of the trauma that would have affected their families and communities. More broadly, Mike's story had become a case study in risk management and institutional failure, demonstrating how the dismissal of expert warnings could lead to catastrophic consequences that far exceeded the cost of addressing identified problems proactively. Business schools had incorporated the Meridian case into their curricula as an example of how short-term thinking and cost-cutting could create massive long-term liabilities. The legal precedents established by the Meridian litigation had fundamentally changed how courts approach cases involving building safety and corporate negligence. Mike's documented warnings to building management had created a new standard for what constituted adequate notice of potential hazards, making it much more difficult for property owners to claim ignorance of dangers that had been identified by qualified professionals. These legal changes had broad implications for how buildings were managed and maintained, with property owners becoming much more responsive to safety concerns raised by tenants, employees, or contractors. The fear of Meridian-level liability had created powerful economic incentives for proactive safety improvements rather than reactive damage control. Mike's consulting work in the years following Meridian had taken him to buildings across the country and around the world, where he had identified dozens of potential disasters and helped implement safety improvements that had prevented countless casualties. Each successful intervention had been personally satisfying for Mike, representing the proactive use of his expertise rather than the reactive heroism that had characterized his rescue career. The international recognition of Mike's expertise had led to consulting opportunities in countries where building safety standards were less developed and where his experience could have even greater impact on protecting vulnerable populations. His work in earthquake-prone regions had been particularly valuable, as his understanding of how buildings fail during structural stress could be applied to improving construction techniques and emergency preparedness in areas where major disasters were inevitable. Mike's training programs for international rescue teams had also had lasting impact, as the techniques he had developed during the Meridian rescue were adapted for use in different cultural and technological contexts. His emphasis on advanced preparation, detailed structural knowledge, and creative problem-solving had proven to be universally applicable principles that could improve rescue outcomes regardless of the specific circumstances of individual disasters. The documentary films and books that had eventually been produced about Mike's story, despite his reluctance to participate directly, had served important educational purposes by helping the general public understand the complexity of building safety issues and the expertise required to address them effectively. While Mike had been uncomfortable with the attention these projects brought to his personal story, he had recognized their value in raising awareness about the importance of structural integrity and emergency preparedness. The scholarship programs that had been established in Mike's honor had created opportunities for students interested in emergency services, structural engineering, and disaster response to receive training that would enable them to carry forward his legacy of using expertise to protect others. These programs have been funded by survivors of the Meridian collapse and by organizations that recognize the broader social value of Mike's work. Mike's influence on building codes and safety regulations had been formalized through his appointment to federal advisory committees that develop standards for construction, maintenance, and emergency response. This work had allowed him to shape policy at the national level, ensuring that the lessons learned from Meridian would be incorporated into requirements that would protect people in buildings across the country. The research collaborations that Mike had participated in with universities and government agencies had advanced scientific understanding of how buildings failed during disasters and how rescue operations could be made more effective. His first-hand experience with structural collapse had provided insights that couldn't be gained through laboratory testing or computer modeling, contributing to advances in both engineering and emergency response techniques. The technology innovations that had emerged from analysis of Mike's rescue techniques had included new equipment designs, communication systems, and training methods that had improved the capabilities of rescue teams worldwide. Companies had developed specialized tools based on the improvised equipment Mike had used during the Meridian rescue, making advanced rescue techniques more accessible to conventional emergency response teams. Mike's advocacy for transparency in building safety information had led to requirements that property owners disclose known structural problems to tenants and workers, and in the practice of concealing safety concerns to avoid liability or financial losses. This transparency had empowered individuals to make informed decisions about their safety and had created additional pressure for property owners to address problems proactively rather than hoping they would never be discovered. The cultural impact of Mike's story had been perhaps the most significant and lasting effect of his heroism during the Meridian collapse. His example had changed how people thought about heroism, service, and the value of expertise, demonstrating that the most important contributions to society often came from people who worked quietly and without recognition until moments of crisis revealed their true character and capabilities. Mike's story had also highlighted the importance of listening to experts and taking their warnings seriously, regardless of their official status or position within organizational hierarchies. The tragedy of Meridian had been that Mike's expertise had been available to prevent the disaster, but his warnings had been dismissed because of assumptions about what janitors could know about structural engineering. The broader lesson of Mike's experience had been that expertise and wisdom could be found in unexpected places, and that society's safety and well-being depended on recognizing and valuing knowledge wherever it existed, rather than making assumptions based on job titles, appearance, or social status. This lesson had had implications far beyond building safety, influencing how organizations approach decision-making, risk assessment, and the utilization of human resources. Years after the Meridian collapse, Mike had continued his work in building safety and emergency preparedness, but he had also found time for quieter pursuits that brought him personal satisfaction and peace. He had returned to some of the hobbies and interests that his rescue career had forced him to abandon, including woodworking, gardening, and volunteer work with local community organizations. These activities had provided Mike with opportunities to use his hands and his mind in constructive ways that didn't involve life or death decisions or the weight of other people's survival resting on his shoulders. The simple satisfaction of building a piece of furniture, growing vegetables in his garden, or helping with community projects had been therapeutic in ways that his high-stress rescue work had never been. But even in retirement from active rescue work, Mike had remained vigilant and prepared for emergencies, unable to completely turn off the instincts and awareness that had defined his career. He continued to assess buildings for structural integrity, to notice potential safety hazards in his daily environment, and to maintain the physical and mental readiness that would allow him to respond effectively if his skills were ever needed again. The balance Mike had found between engagement and withdrawal, between using his expertise to help others and protecting his own psychological well-being, had been hard-won but deeply satisfying. He had learned to value both his extraordinary capabilities and his ordinary humanity, understanding that his worth as a person wasn't dependent on his heroism during disasters, but on his day-to-day choices about how to treat others and how to use his gifts in service of something larger than himself. Mike's legacy had become more than just the lives he had saved during the Meridian collapse. It had become a demonstration of how expertise, dedication, and moral courage could combine to create impacts that extended far beyond any individual action. His story had shown that heroism wasn't just about dramatic moments of crisis, but about the quiet preparation, persistent vigilance, and ethical commitment that made effective action possible when those moments arose. And somewhere in America, in buildings across the country and around the world, people went about their daily lives a little safer because of the work Mike Sullivan had done, the standards he had helped establish, and the culture of safety consciousness he had helped create. They might never know his name or understand the role he had played in protecting them from dangers they couldn't see, but they were alive and safe because one man had refused to ignore warning signs, had prepared himself for the worst-case scenario, and had been willing to risk everything to save people who had never noticed he was there. That, Mike had learned, was what real heroism looked like. Not the dramatic rescue operations that made headlines, but the patient, persistent, often invisible work of making the world a little safer for everyone who lived in it. Heroes didn't always wear uniforms or carry badges. Sometimes they wore coveralls and push-mop buckets, watching and waiting and preparing for the moments when their vigilance would mean the difference between tragedy and survival. The quiet heroes who walked among us every day, whose greatest victories were disasters that never happened because they had done their jobs properly, and whose deepest satisfaction came from knowing that their dedication meant others could trust in the safety of the buildings that sheltered them, the systems that protected them, and the expertise of the people who watched over them even when they didn't know they were being watched over. Mike Sullivan had been one of those heroes, and his story reminded us all that the most important protection we have against the dangers of the world often comes from people we never notice, whose names we never learn, and whose sacrifices we never fully understand. But they are there, watching and waiting and preparing, ready to stand between us and disaster when the moment comes that tests everything they've learned and everything they prepared for. And that knowledge, that somewhere among the ordinary people we pass every day are extraordinary individuals capable of extraordinary things, is perhaps the most comforting truth of all.